You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Eggleseth.
We are continuing our history series today with the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie as we look at Pilgrims, Puritans, and the founding of New England. Thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin for supporting The Coffee Hour. You can find out more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu.
Live uncommon.
Our guest today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dr. MacKenzie, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
So last time we learned about, the preparationists. We learned about the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, and you mentioned a little bit about Anne Hutchinson and the preparationists. Well, tell me a little bit more about where do you want to pick up with that?
I think we can pick it up right there. In New England, they've established the church. The settlements in New England each have a church. They have a pastor. They're not a huge number of them, but Boston's the most important by far. And there is a division of opinion in the leadership. Thomas Hooker was one of those who believed strongly in preparation, and that simply meant that if you were one of the elect, you'd get to that election, you'd get to being a true Christian by going to church, doing spiritual exercises. You'd go through a particular pattern, and then you would be called by God the Holy Spirit, or not, depending. Wouldn't be automatic, but nonetheless, that was the track you needed to be on. And then there were others like John Cotton who rejected that notion and argued, no, God would see to it that you were called when he wanted to call you and in the way he wanted to call you. Yes, it would be in connection with preaching and so forth, but there would be none of this pattern to your life necessarily before you were saved. So we've got this argument. And into this debate or argument, there comes a lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson. Now, let me tell you a little bit about her. Anne Hutchinson, in Old England, had been a member of John Cotton's church, along with her husband, William Hutchinson. They had joined the first church. Well, they had been a member of Cotton's church in Old England. And when he had left for New England, they had followed along a couple years later. And when they arrived, they joined the First Church of Boston, where John Cotton was part of the clergy. Anne Hutchinson once said, when our teacher, Mr. Cotton, was put down in England, there was none in England that I durst hear. So John Cotton was gone. She and her family had to follow him to New England. So they did. Okay. Well, she's been there some months, and then she starts to do something. It was not terrible, but it was a little unusual. She started having weekly meetings in her home for the purpose of discussing some of Pastor Cotton's sermons. And she praised his sermons because he insisted on inward signs of saving grace. You could feel the movement of the Spirit in your heart and in your life. And she criticized those who were stressing sanctification as a proof of salvation. For Hutchinson, God granted salvation to whomever he pleased, and human actions, preparation, could in no way influence God's decision, nor could they establish any proof of one's election. So those preachers who were emphasizing good works, either as preparation or proof of election, and that was many of the Puritan ministers, Anne Hutchinson said they're placing too much emphasis on works. Quoting her again, she said, I bless the Lord that he hath let me see which was the clear ministry, think John Cotton, and which was the wrong, think the others. So it was not outward works, but the inner work of the Spirit, which was the proof. She said, here is a great stir about graces and looking to hearts. But give me Christ. I seek not for graces, but for Christ. I seek not for promises, but for Christ. I seek not for sanctification, but for Christ. Tell me not of meditation and duties, but tell me of Christ. That sounds better than it looks, because she's not talking about Christ as he speaks to us in his word, but Christ as she experiences him in her heart and life. Well, within a couple of years, Anne Hutchinson had developed quite a following. There's a good estimate that maybe more than half of the church in Boston were following her lead. And this included her brother-in-law. His name was John Wheelwright, and he was a clergyman who had arrived in New England after having been removed in Old England from the Anglican ministry. That was still the period of William Laud and so forth. But he was a clergyman, and he was invited, actually by Carden, to preach a sermon on one of those fast days, a day of prayer and humiliation. And this was called by the government, concerned about divisions in the colony. So he preached January of 1637, and he decided to use this opportunity to denounce those clergy whom he deemed inadequate in their proclamation of grace. These were the ones who were teaching that sanctification was a proof of justification. He said they are under a covenant of works. The more holy they are, he said, the greater enemies that they are to Christ. So Wheelwright summoned his hearers to do battle with the preparationists. We must lay load upon them. We must kill them with the word of the Lord. Very, very strong sermon. And as a result, he was arrested, and he was convicted of sedition for his sermon. Outside of Boston, some of Hutchinson's followers heckled the pastors as they preached. Now, one complicating factor for the preparationists, those who were anti-Hutchinson, was the fact that another newcomer by the name of Henry Vane had arrived, and he no sooner had arrived than he had been chosen governor of the colony. Accordingly, he and Winthrop were political opponents, and Henry Vane, the governor, defended Wheelwright at the next meeting of the General Court. That's the General Assembly of Massachusetts. This was May of 1637. However, the opponents of the governor knew Massachusetts better than he did. He's brand new. And they also knew how to pull some of the levers of power. And they saw to it that meeting of the General Court was held in Cambridge, not Boston. Now, today, Cambridge and Boston are minutes apart. But in those days, travel was a lot more difficult. And so those who made it to Cambridge the majority was in support of Winthrop and anti-Hutchinson. So the Boston delegation was numerically smaller than it might have otherwise been had they been in Boston. So in point of fact, Vane lost his bid for re-election and very shortly thereafter left New England, went back to Old England. Winthrop then and his party were pretty securely put into power once again, and they were able to deal with Wheelwright and Hutchinson. And I'll explain how in just a moment here. But before I do, I'll just mention this about Henry Vane. So he's here only for about a year. By 1637, he's back in Old England. His father was pretty well connected with service to the king, and Vane then had access to government positions and the like. But when the Civil War erupted in 1642, Vane worked with the Parliament and was an important leader in the rebellion against Charles I, and was there when Oliver Cromwell was in power and so forth. Finally, in the 1660s, when the monarchy was restored, this same guy who'd been governor of Massachusetts was actually executed for treason against the monarchy. So he's got a very interesting life story, and only a little bit of it is in Massachusetts, but the little bit in Massachusetts is kind of interesting too. So, all right, under Winthrop now, the crisis regarding Anne Hutchinson reaches a climax. Winthrop thought that Hutchinson's views were a threat to law and order because he understood her as saying that every person could be impelled by the Spirit to become like a law unto himself or herself, as indeed Hutchinson sometimes seemed to say. So Hutchinson was also put on a trial for sedition. This was after the clergy had met and they had defined precisely what it was, what doctrines were at stake, regarding which Wheelwright and Hutchinson were heretics. Cotton, who, remember, he had been Hutchinson's pastor, and he was the one why she had come to New England in the first place, separates himself from her, and he votes along with the rest of the clergy to condemn Hutchinson's viewpoint. In November of 1637, Hutchinson was tried before the general court on a variety of charges surrounding her support of Wheelwright, the heretic who'd been condemned. And finally, during her interrogation, again, there's no law against self-incrimination. You've got to testify. So she testified. She was interrogated, and the dialogue went something like this. Hutchinson says, "Well, how did Abraham know that it was God who bid him offer his son, being a breach of the fifth commandment?" The attorney for the other side answered, "He knew it by an immediate voice." Hutchinson said, "So to me, by an immediate revelation." How? An immediate revelation? Hutchinson, yes, by the voice of his own spirit to my soul. Well, that was enough for the court. Hutchinson was what we'd call an enthusiast. She wasn't going to be governed by the word as interpreted by the clergy. She's going to follow her own promptings of the Spirit. So she was condemned. She was excommunicated from the church, and she was told she had to get out of town. And that meant not only she, but her husband and her children, and there were about 60 others, agreed with her. They left in March of 1638, still not the greatest weather in New England at the time. Well, where did they go? Well, they went to the southern part of New England, which was outside of the borders established for Massachusetts, into kind of no man's land. And that no man's land was what ended up becoming Rhode Island. So she and her little group founded what today is Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Later on, her husband died, and she and her family moved to New York, where she finally died herself. I've got one little piece of trivia about her yet that's interesting. Her great-great-grandson, Thomas Hutchinson, became the governor of Massachusetts right at the time of the American Revolution, and he was the last royal, loyal governor of Massachusetts. Finally ended up leaving Massachusetts and returning to England there to live out his days. So anyway, that's the Anne Hutchinson story.
That is fascinating. We have more to talk about right after this break. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Golseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
At Concordia University, Wisconsin, we believe you were created for a reason: to use your God-given gifts to help others, to live a life of self-sacrifice in a me-first world, to live a life that's uncommon. Whether you're taking one of 50-plus online programs or learning with us in person on the shores of Lake Michigan, you'll be equipped to make an uncommon impact. Learn more at cuw.edu. Concordia University, Wisconsin. Live uncommon.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
We're talking with the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, about the history of the Pilgrims, Puritans, and founding of New England. And in the first part of our conversation today, we got the story of Anne Hutchinson. Where are we going from there?
Well, since we brought up Rhode Island, we should probably talk about the even more famous founder of Rhode Island, and that's Roger Williams.
Aha.
Again, I'm not sure that we'll finish him today, but we can at least give it a good try. Roger Williams. Now, we remember him today as one of the principal founders of Rhode Island. He also turns out to be, unlike his contemporaries, an actual champion of what we think of religious liberty. So Roger Williams is important historically for being one of the first voices in favor of religious liberty that comes to characterize the United States even to this day. He was also one of the first Baptists in America. So a lot of firsts connected with Williams. Now, to begin with, he's like the other clergymen that we've talked about here in connection with New England, and that is he was an Anglican clergyman. He had studied at the Cambridge University. Subsequent to his graduation, he decided, along with his wife, who came from a Puritan family, that instead of trying to go of it in England, they should go to New England. So he actually arrived pretty early. He got here in February of 1631. Interestingly, on the voyage over, as he was thinking about church and the kind of church that ought to be created and so forth, he came to the conviction that the separatists were actually correct rather than the Puritans. That is, the right thing to do was actually to leave the Church of England and establish a pure church unconnected to England here in New England. So that's his conviction. But he had a bad experience with a congregation in Salem, which he first served, and as a result of which he left that church after a very short time and then moved to Boston, where for a while he ministered in the Boston church. But he's in and out of trouble with the authorities. He's never getting along with them. And the Boston church he finds unsatisfactory because it had not formally separated itself from the Church of England. And as a result, it would not expressly repent of its past connection with the Church of England. He also was very critical of settlers who just took Indian lands without bargaining for them. He also thought that the civil authorities, should be responsible for the first table of the law as well as the second table of the law, and that meant to enforce oaths and worship and all the rest, which they weren't yet doing. So he was just very unhappy there. So he left Boston and went to Plymouth, and he was in Plymouth then for a couple of years, but he didn't like Plymouth. One of the things that bothered him was that members of the Plymouth plantation who went back to England for a while would participate in some of the Church of England services, and he thought that was wrong. If you're separate, you should be separate. And then, as William Bradford, the historian of Plymouth, put it, he fell into some strange opinions which caused some controversy between the church and him. We don't know what those strange opinions were, but in a few years, we'll find out what some of them likely were. So he left Plymouth, went back to Massachusetts. This is 1633, to take a post at yet another church. No peace. He wants that church to separate from the other churches in Massachusetts. He's a separatist. You ought to be pure. At length, the government of Massachusetts ordered him to go back to England. They kicked him out of the colony. But before he could be deported, after all, you had to wait for a ship that was going back to England before you could send somebody back, he skipped town took his family and a few supporters, January of 1636, during the fierce New England winter, down to the south, outside of Massachusetts Bay, to what today we call Rhode Island, and he helped to settle the city of Providence, Rhode Island. So Portsmouth, Anne Hutchinson, Providence, Rhode Island, by Roger Williams. He named it Providence, as he later wrote, "I desired that it might be for a shelter for persons distressed for conscience." So he wanted Providence to be a place where people who were distressed for reasons of conscience could come. And that meant religious dissenters like him. Now, on account of Rhode Island being created by their dissidents, the people of Massachusetts referred to Rhode Island as the sewer of New England. That was their view of the people who were settling there. As leader of the colony, Williams purchased land from the Indians, and then he distributed land to others for their use. He befriended the Indians, obviously. He even learned their language. During one of the colonial wars between the settlers and the Indians, he acted as a negotiator to restore peace. He was always solicitous of the Indians. In 1643, he published a key into the language of the natives in that part of America called New England. It's kind of a dictionary, also kind of an anthropology, and actually includes spiritual observations about the nature of their religion. He thought they were perfectly good candidates for conversion, arguing that, and I'm quoting him here, "Nature knows no difference between Europeans and Americans in blood, birth, bodies, and so forth, God having of one blood made mankind." And that's really quite a statement for somebody living in the 17th century. Well, in religious policy, Williams adopted the principle that God requireth not an uniformity of religion for providence, and therefore he made sure that this was the first colony to offer, quote, soul liberty, or what we would call religious freedom. Now, Rhode Island had kind of a very limited legal basis. So in 1642, Williams went back to England to get a charter for Rhode Island. Massachusetts wanted to kind of get the colony for themselves, but he wanted to have, independence from Massachusetts and also Connecticut at that time. And he got one. He got a charter from Parliament, but this is after the Civil War has begun, so it's a parliamentary charter, not a royal charter. But it did fix the boundaries, and for the first time in a legal document, it granted religious liberty to all of its inhabitants. And I'll quote this first charter. "All men may walk as their conscience persuade them, every one in the name of his God. And let the saints of the Most High walk in this colony without molestation in the name of Jehovah their God forever and ever." It was also while in London that Williams published an appeal for religious liberty. He called it the bloody tenet of persecution. And I'll quote this, too. It's kind of interesting because he's talking about his view of government in relationship to religion. And he says, "There is a civil sword called the sword of civil justice, which being of a material civil nature for the defense of persons, estates, families, liberties of a city or civil estate, and for the suppressing of uncivil or injurious persons or actions by such civil punishments, that civil sword cannot, according to its utmost reach and capacity, now under Christ, when all nations are merely civil, without any such typical holy respect upon them as was upon Israel, a national church, I say, cannot extend to spiritual and soul causes, spiritual and soul punishment, which belongs to that spiritual sword with two edges, the soul piercing, in soul saving or soul killing, namely the Word of God." So that was Roger Williams' on religious liberty. Got a little bit more to say about them, but maybe we'll have to save that for next time.
Very good. We'll take a look at more on Roger Williams and Rhode Island in our next conversation. Our guest today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thanks for being our guest today.
I was happy to be so. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support The Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@kfuo.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.